We're good? All right. So I titled my talk Node.js with Docker Swarm. Well, I'm not going to do a deep dive into Docker Swarm itself, but I think it's a very, I guess the main theme here is like just Docker. Who's using Docker right now in production? Yeah. And so the theme that kind of like what's brought me to this project that I'm working on right now is onboarding. You know, I worked in many companies before, and you get onboarded, and it takes like 3 weeks or 4 weeks or months just to onboard because you have to download everything, right? You got to make sure all the files are correct, all the your laptop is set up. It just takes a long time. It takes mind share. You got to go bug another developer, and so on and so forth. And with Docker, you know, you can easily spin it up, and it's just great. You can get up and running. So one of the things that I guess you can. So one of the benefits that I guess one of the fantasies that I have when I join a company is onboarding literally just takes 1 day, in the sense that they're set up with Docker. You do a Docker compose build, Docker compose up. You have your systems up and running, and then the rest of the day maybe they're just teaching you, or you have to learn the architecture or the system components, how the applications are connected and everything, and that's it. And the next day you come in and start cracking out some code. And so this is kind of the mindset I came into this project. It's called the bookpundit.app. You can access it right now on your laptops and on your mobile phones. It is mobile app. It probably looks really funky on a desktop or on a tablet. But so I made this app because I was invited to give a talk at a South by on React. And so this application does have 3 pieces to it: the front end app and 2 backend apps components. One's a service and one is the APIs, and I'll get to that in a bit. And you can, right now, you can go into the GitHub repos. If you clone it and you just do Docker compose build, wait like 6 minutes to download the initial payloads. And then you do Docker compose up, and you have the application working in your laptop, you know, within 10 minutes, which is great. There's 2 services. One's the router, and one's the API. And I'll get into it in a bit. So show you what the app looks like. So it's called Book Pundit. The idea here is, you know, you're looking for books, you know, and you want to know what people are saying about books. I'm a bookworm, so I kind of wonder what the critics are saying about things. In this case, you know, HTML. And so you get back a list of books with stars and just very basic metadata. And you click on one of these guys, you get a little spinner, and you get what people are talking about it, right? And this data is being pulled from Goodreads. Initially, I wanted to pull from Goodreads, AWS, and GoReads is another one, and a few other online reading platforms. AWS rejected my API, so I got stuck with Goodreads and bummed out, so I just stuck with Goodreads. Anyway, so you come through the application, you click on it, and that's pretty much it. It's a very simple application. You know, it does a few things. It does a history, it keeps a history of what you searched in the app. Just go through, click on that. It's fetching the data, right? It's actually live crawling Goodreads, pulling that data in, parsing the junk that Goodreads give me, passing that through up to the application and out to the front end. And this is the result of that. Come in and you can like erase your history. And if you are a front-end developer, a full-stack developer, you can actually come into the React dev tools and see what's happening. If you do have the Redux, I'm using Redux, you can have some fun with that, right? You can see all the stuff. The application is React, Redux, and Redux sagas. And it's all in the repo. If you want to play with, if you want to see the front end, where I also use some of that React suspense and React lazy loading and whatnot, if you're curious to learn about that. And all this is all wired up together in the back end with, I hooked up with Kibana. So it's happening right now. So if you go in there and you search for something, it will show up in the logs. So it's just and you start seeing the data come in. The hardest part of this whole project was getting logging down, believe it or not. It wasn't learning Docker Swarm. It was just getting the logging together, son of a bitch. So once we have the app up and running, right, following the onboarding theme, you want to get a big picture of the application. And here you see pretty much this is the simple application, what it is for. I'm using Netlify to host the static assets. I have a 2-node service provisioned. I'm using Vultr. It's kind of like it's very similar to DigitalOcean if you're familiar with DigitalOcean. It's very similar to that. I have an Nginx running. I have the logger box right here, right? There's FluentBit is the log collector. Elasticsearch is a parser / aggregator, and Kibana is the front end that we see. And it's a very simple app. I just have a back end service. I call it a router. All it does is routes the client's requests. If it's there, if it's in Postgres, it just pulls the data from Postgres. If it's not, it's going to hit the other node. And this node basically is made up a bunch of these I call APIs. And they're very dumb. They're very functional. They only do one thing only, and that's like pull from Goodreads. You pull from Goodreads, you parse the data, there's iframes, you got to parse all that stuff. But they don't do anything else, right? They just get the data from Goodreads, take care of the transforming of the data, and just pass it right back to the router in Node 1. And so the idea here was that you can spin up Goodreads, AWS, GoReads, and a few others of these book repositories, and spin up in these Node 2 provisions, and spin up as many containers as you can. Right now I'm doing 5 containers, and someone can come join the team, and maybe when AWS does approve me, I can come in here and just work on the back end of the APIs, inject that into there without touching the other provisional Node 1 service, right? So I kind of like segmented it this way so that I can just work on one thing at a time and not worry about disturbing the flow of the other one. And that's pretty much the big picture of the application. Take a little dive into the actual service. So the back end is written in Koa, Koa.js. Anyone using Koa.js? No one? It's very similar to Express. The only difference is that it's it's unopinioned completely, right? For Koa, you have to import the libraries that you want. For example, a router, the middleware, cores, everything that you as a developer or your service needs, you have to either write your own library or just import the library already there. Yeah. Oh, sure. And so this service here is kind of like if you were onboarding and you're sitting down and you're talking to a developer and they're trying to walk you through how the system is set up without going to the whiteboard and drawing pictures and then having to bring in like 5 other developers because you can't remember everything in your head. So this kind of represents what that router service, that Node 1 is made up, right? The components and how they interact with each other. You have the red is inputs, the yellow is outputs. So this service only has two endpoints. One is search and one is reviews. And then I have these these boxes, like these pipelines. I don't know if you can see that. No. And so for the search, right, when you go in there, you hit like James Clavell or something for some book, it goes into the first pipeline, the top pipeline. The reviews come into the bottom pipeline. And so this first box is what I call my router. And so in this router, it has like an Express, right? You have your gets and you get your puts, whatever. You have very basic functionality that is shared code between both routes. In this case, the validate search term and the hydrate book. If the book that you're searching is already cached, I don't have to go out to the backend anymore. All right, I just hydrate it and I serve that piece up. And so that's very common in the first box. The second part, I have these pipelines: fetch book, return book, and store books. The three main functionalities for getting your search results. And then for the reviews, you have these four main functionalities, and they're very, very basic functions. They're not classes. They're not anything elaborate. I can come in there and add more functions to it, right? Just like in your pipeline. And towards the end, I have what I call endpoints. So in this one diagram, I'm kind of trying to convey that there's pipelines, there's endpoints, right? The major components that make up this application: Postgres, endpoints, there's a response handler. And for the dumb, what I call my dumb containers, my dumb APIs, these guys don't really do anything. They're just very basic functions that hit the endpoints of, in this case, it's Goodreads. And the only endpoints that Goodreads uses are these four kind of like imperial commands: search book, get books, get full review, get iframe kind of commands, where the endpoints just reach out into Goodreads, their APIs and their web pages, and just scraping that crap out of them. And so, and this is very piecemeal, and I'll show in the code base in a bit that it's really dumb. Like, this container can be wiped out. You can add more pipelines into this, remove pipelines without really affecting much of the system in general. So in my service, is that a good size? A little bit bigger? All right. What's up? So this is the router. This is the first box. It's the first box right here where the entry points are. And you see here, I have my search router entry point. I have my two functions that's going to be hit. And then it passes the rest to my search pipeline. And it's the same thing in my book reviews, right? The main router, I use very generalized functions that are shared between both APIs, but they have different pipelines. And again, this is just a COA, right? You have to import the router. It's very similar to the Express router. And so my first pipeline, and so my folder structure here, the main components are APIs, database, endpoints, which is everything external. I got a few middleware, they're really important, and the router. And so in my APIs, I have two APIs. This service exposes two APIs, the reviews and search. And so if we take a little deep dive into the search router, so this router maps to here. And so here are my three functions that this router takes care of, right? My pipeline. And it goes through this sequence of steps. Fetch books means go to my other service APIs. Return books, serve the data back to the client, and then store it. So in this case, as soon as the node service gets the data, I feed it back to the client, and then I save it to the database, right? I made a trade-off there. Instead of saving it first, I'd rather have a good user experience in this case than who cares if it's not stored in a database. I just fetch it again. And so it looks very similar. And so this pattern is very similar to all the APIs here, right? So if you're onboarding, you start seeing a generalized pattern here. My endpoints are my GoodRead API, which is the other node service, and my Postgres. My endpoints are very command-centric, very imperial, in imperial mood. Get book lists, get book reviews, insert into the database, right? And the same, very similar vocabulary in when I get the data from the other node service, get book lists and get reviews. And I mean, the functions are very simple. They're nothing elaborate. You know, you set it up, you do a little logging, you get the endpoints. You use, if you're familiar with backend, or sorry, with Redux actions, I kind of adopted that pattern to this project. And so so the Redux pattern is state and actions. In this case, it's kind of like I'm passing in the action that I want for the endpoint, and then the parameters needed to accomplish that action. So a lot of the same conceptual techniques for the front end I'm using for the back end as well. And then for my dumb containers, right? There's a GoodReads. The main components here are services. So initially, you know, AWS, GoodReads, GoReads, and these other services. Middleware, again, we can ignore that. And then API response. So in services, I follow the same pattern, kind of like this fractal pattern. The router is set up the same way. Every /gr for GoodReads comes through this pipeline. The APIs, the GoodReads has 2, reviews and search. The router, very similar pattern, right? So when onboarding, it's a very generalized pattern, very simple. It follows, Koa is very, very flexible in this way. I love it. You can put it together in every way you want it. And this main pipeline is very long. You can see a bunch of these functionalities. But essentially, it's kind of like web scraping. If you're very familiar with web scraping, no matter what you do, they're going to update the website and it's going to break stuff. And so another reason why I wanted the service away from the main component service is because when that happens, I don't want anything else to go wrong, nor do I want to spin up a new, I don't want it to kind of like backflow back into my other services. And if I need to do any fixes, I can just pick this one library or this one service, in this case, GoodReads, and deploy it just for GoodReads and deploy the containers just for GoodReads, right? Without impacting the overall structure. And API responses. And so the diagram is very much, I try very hard to map the diagram to the folder structure to get a good idea what's going on when communicating this, when onboarding. And so that's pretty much the big picture of what, you know, of explaining how the services talk and how the services connect. I'm working on another project now where it's probably the same, very similar patterns, but now I'm scraping tech blogs. And so it's going to be the exact same thing, maybe just a bigger provisioning of the servers, but the concept is the same. This pattern can be applied to many things. And so again, the main components for the folder layout, you know, the APIs, router, right? I think a lot of us are used to the MVC, kind of like the models and the controllers, middleware from the Ruby on Rails paradigm. Kind of like it follows the same idea, but different, right? The components here are APIs, router, middleware, databases, and how they all talk together. And for the APIs in the back end, the main one is services, APIs, router, and endpoints. And so initially I wrote all this stuff pretty fast. It's just a node, right? You can easily develop. But it was very, I guess I wanted to work with a buddy of mine, and I wanted to get him on board, but he had a Windows machine. I don't have Windows machine. I don't know how to use Windows machine. So it was very difficult for him to get up and running. And so I, quit my job, started learning about Docker, Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, all that back end stuff. I guess you get kind of bored when you do a bunch of full stack. You want to do something new. So I took a deep dive into this, and it's super amazing what Docker does for any project, especially for local development. The onboarding experiences that I've had in the past have been bad. And so with that in mind, if you haven't used Docker, highly recommend learning Docker. Just even for local development, even if you're not using it for production or anything, just for your own sanity. It's very awesome. And it's also very fun to share because it's super easy to set up. And so Docker, you have your images, you have your containers and your registry. Images are basically the executable packages. Containers are what happens when you run these packages, the results of that. In a registry, I kind of see it like a GitHub repo where the image, the thing that's being executed or will be executed lives. Right? That's kind of like the main components of a Docker. Docker Compose is an aggregate of the services. So in this case, I have a bunch of services. I have the Book Pundit service. I have the Book Pundit API service. I have the the Nginx service. I have the FluentBit service. I have Elasticsearch service, and then I have the Kibana service. And Docker Compose kind of stitches them together for you very simply. All you do, it's very declarative. You tell it what to do instead of how. And Docker Engine reads those instructions and kind of does its magic. Like I said, you can go to the repo right now, Docker Compose build, Docker Compose up, and you're up and running. And Docker Swarm is kind of like this manager or this orchestrator of your containers, right? Because Docker makes it super easy to destroy and start new containers. You can have many of these, and Docker Swarm helps you kind of how manage the clusters of your containers. And again, very easy to set up and run. And with a single command, using your Docker Compose file, which you already made during development, Docker stack deploy, and you're up and running in production. And just to show you how that looks like in the code. So I have two Docker Compose, one for local development and one for production use. The main difference is just deployment, resources, how much resources does the service consume and whatnot. So I have my services here. Proxy is my Nginx, Elasticsearch, Kibana, and FluentBit. And so here I tell Docker what I wanted to do. So for my Nginx, for example, I have my images that's pulling from my repository. I'm just going to call this a dumb container name. If I do local logging, uncomment that. So it will use a FluentBit. You expose the ports that are be accessible to the public. In this case, local development, and you assign networks to it. And then there's dependencies. So this service will not spin up until this Book Pundit service begins. And so there's definitely a hill to climb when you're learning Docker, but it's so much worth it because once you learn this skill set, it just applies for everything. It doesn't have to be NodeJS, right? This can be any programming language or any kind of setup that you have going on. And then for my production, just to show the contrast, so my proxy is very similar. The only difference is that I'm using Let's Encrypt, right, for production use. And that's pretty much it. The only difference there. For my Kibana, right, I tell the resources. deploy is a key word in the Docker Compose. So when you deploy it into production or you deploy it to the swarm, the Docker engine reads this and makes sure that the machine has this much memory allocated to it and can only consume 900, right? And so it's, again, you're very declarative in the way that you deploy your Docker Compose. And there's this role here of like manager and worker nodes. So back in my diagram, node 1 service is a manager. That's where my database is. So I want this to be very beefy. I want it to be like super secure, right? I want to have more of a management like functionality. I want to SSH into this service. I want to look at everything, get a picture of how my service is running, how much memory I have, and so on and so forth. Whereas in node 2, I don't really care. It's a worker node. If something goes wrong there, I don't really care. Just restart the server or remove the server, bring up a new service. I mean, I don't really care about that kind of stuff. And Docker gives you ability to, right, to make to risk your bets here. They're very flexible in that way. It adopts like your development patterns. And again, very similar to my dumb service, which is even, right, I really have nothing here, which is just one service, the book APIs. Because they all belong to the same swarm, this API service has access to whatever the manager exposes, in this case, the logging. So the logging lives in the first node, but any other node or provisional server who has access to that swarm can access it without, all you have to do is specify it in your Docker Compose file, declare it, hey, listen to this address, and whatever you log, make sure it goes to this point, right? In these 5 lines, you're up and running. A cool thing about if you do run it in, so I'm just gonna run it real quick, Docker Compose up. Let me put a D on that. One thing that, oh, I guess not. I have to. What's that? I don't want logging when I do development. Maybe that was it. Oh yeah, I gotta turn. Which one depends on? I'm not really sure. Elastic's. Thank you, VS Code. So, because I'm in development, and how many people use Nodeman? So basically, when you start, when you do a Docker Compose up, right? It's like a VM is set up, and that VM has all the functionality associated with it. So locally, you don't have to download NodeJS, Postgres, all these other software onto the actual machine. They're all downloaded into this virtual machine. And with that, you can plug in this virtual machine with your file system locally, so that when you start doing development, you can still use Nodeman that will pick up the changes that you do. So just show you an example. This is, I went inside a container, and the container is running the application, and these are the logs that the application is outputting. And so when I develop, I'm developing, changing code base and everything, and making sure the logs are working right, because I use the logs to help me debug the services. And so in this case, I don't know, you're going to throw in another So Nodeman picks up the changes, even though my code base lives locally on my machine outside of the containers. I wire them up together so that any code changes that I do locally on my machine, the containers pick up, right? And so you just have that fluid development flow without any issues. And if there is issues, right, all you have to do literally is Docker compose down, right? Tears everything down, and then Docker compose up, and you're back up and running, right? So it's kind of like turning it on and off again. Maybe a little extreme. I rarely do that. I really just do this, and I'm off, right? I'm up to racetracks. Yeah, and so that picture, when I started this project, I kind of just drew these boxes, and I was like, all right, I want to do this, I want to do that. You know, after reading a lot about Docker, I kind of figured out, okay, let me see what I can do with it. Let's see how much fun I can have with it. What are the difficulties associated with it? And the talk that I got invited to at South by was a perfect opportunity for me to actually put what I read into practice, and this is kind of like the result of that. So that's it. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to help you answer. Yeah.
Hang on, I'll bring you the mic.
Yeah, not sure if you're familiar with Kubernetes, but is Docker Swarm a similar service like that's just container orchestration in production?
Docker Swarm is probably the red-headed stepchild. I mean, I was talking to Matt a few minutes ago, but I mean, I think you can probably better answer this question.
So Docker Swarm was Docker's SWAC at doing server-side orchestration, like cloud orchestration, to give you your own like little your VPC with your own servers and fluid ability to bring up containers, and you don't care where the containers are, right? In comparison with Kubernetes, it's a lot easier to use, but it's not as powerful. And what ended up happening is, so they implemented it so that you can build your own Docker Swarm, whether you do it on like DigitalOcean or AWS. And they even made a thing which was Docker Swarm for AWS, which was a CloudFormation template, which would be like one click and you have a swarm. But what they stopped doing was supporting the CloudFormation template. And so upgrades became difficult. So we were using this where I was working as well. It's like super, it's much easier to get up to speed using Docker Swarm than it is Kubernetes. But since they stopped maintaining it, people were like, well, what's going on here? And starting to ask questions. And then what they announced was that Docker's now going to start implementing the same metaphors for Docker Swarm on top of Kubernetes. So they're like putting an abstraction between what Roberto is using here and having it do everything with Kube. And that's probably going to come out over like the next 6 months or a year or something like that. So there's still a benefit to learning this stuff. But I think what'll end up happening is they'll just, like, they're doing the simpler version of hiding away what's going on inside Kubernetes going forward. But to answer your question, yes, it's a container orchestration service. Anybody else have questions? Cool. Cool. Thanks, Roberto.